We live in times where happiness is sold as a product, an idealized lifestyle where everything works, where there is no pain, no frustration, no uncomfortable silence. From an early age, we are taught to chase this ideal as if it were a natural promise of existence. Advertisements, social media, movies, and optimistic gurus all reinforce the same idea. If you try hard enough, if you are disciplined, if you think positively, one day you will be completely happy. But what if that promise is an illusion? Why? In this reflection, we'll dive into the thought of one of the most brutal and honest philosophers of the human condition. Schopenhauer did not offer easy consolation. He forces us to face what we prefer to ignore, the tragic structure of existence. Yet in doing so, paradoxically, he may offer us the only form of true freedom, lucidity. From birth, we are shaped by an invisible narrative. It tells us there is a place we must reach, a stable and permanent state of happiness that will validate our entire existence. This narrative is delivered subtly but incessantly in the perfect smile of celebrities, in the idealized couples of commercials, in the professional success goals that promise fulfillment. The trap is subtle because it doesn't look like a trap. It just sounds like common sense. After all, who doesn't want to be happy? But Schopenhauer warns us what we call happiness is actually nothing more than the temporary absence of pain. It is not a positive state, but an interval, like the silence between two notes of a sorrowful song. He writes, "Positive and true happiness is impossible. The best we can hope for is a relatively bearable existence." This may sound grim, but think for a moment. How many times have you intensely desired something, a trip, a relationship, an achievement, and once you got it, the satisfaction the happiness we imagine is a mirage in the desert. The more we chase it, the further it seems. Schopenhauer exposes this cruel logic and invites us to look at life without the filters of modern propaganda. He invites us to stop running. But what lies behind this endless race? To understand why we may never be happy the way we imagine, we must grasp the most central and devastating concept of Schopenhauer's philosophy, the will. Not the rational, conscious will we use to decide what to eat or wear, but a much deeper force, unconscious, impersonal, a vital energy that pulses in everything that lives. A blind, irrational force that simply wants to keep existing, that desires for the sake of desiring, that moves for the sake of moving. Schopenhauer writes, "The will is in itself a blind and incessant force, devoid of knowledge, yet it moves the entire universe. This will manifests in us as constant desire, never satisfied, never fulfilled. What we call the self is merely the individualized appearance of this universal will. That's why we suffer, because we are dominated by a force that always wants more. When we obtain something, a new desire instantly appears. And this cycle has no end. This realization is brutal, but reveals a truth we all silently sense. There is something inside us that is never satisfied, even when we have everything. The will, being blind, does not pursue a greater good. It has no higher purpose. It simply wants to keep affirming itself, whether through pleasure, status, power, or love. It is what drags us from cradle to grave. And here lies the irony. The very will that animates us is also the source of our suffering. We are driven by it, and because of that, condemned to endless longing. In Schopenhauer's words, life oscillates like a pendulum between pain and boredom. If we lack what we want, we suffer. If we achieve it, we grow bored, and then we desire again. The promise of happiness in this view is not only illusory, it is a mechanism of the will to keep us in motion. It never intends to be fulfilled. Happiness is the bait. Desire is the hook. And we are the fish. The promise of happiness is one of the most persuasive narratives the human mind has ever built. But Schopenhauer dismantles this promise by revealing the hidden machinery behind it, the endless cycle of desire. For him, to desire is to suffer, and paradoxically, to stop desiring is to fall into boredom, which is simply another form of suffering. The logic is cruel. We desire something, feel the pain of not having it, then feel a brief relief when we obtain it, only to be followed by emptiness, and then desire again. This repetition forms what Schopenhauer called the wheel of torment. Nothing we acquire remains a source of lasting satisfaction. Joy is transient. Pain is constant. He writes, "The life of a man from beginning to end is an unbroken series of desires whose successes are only temporary and whose frustrations are inevitable." This idea is not merely philosophical, it's visceral. Think of the times you believed that something external would resolve your inner anguish. A new love, a bigger house, a better body, a career achievement. And when you finally got there, what happened? A few days of euphoria, then silence. That silence, which should have been peace, becomes restlessness. And your mind starts hunting for the next goal, the next reason to feel alive. It is at this point that Schopenhauer is at his most severe and perhaps most truthful. He declares that pain is not an accident of life, it is the structure of life. But then, what remains for us? If desire imprisons us and happiness is an illusion, is there any way out? Schopenhauer did not leave us empty-handed. He points to paths, not of salvation, but of temporary release from the tyranny of the will. Chief among them is art. In deep aesthetic experience, listening to a piece of music that lifts us, contemplating a work of art that moves us, losing the sense of time before beauty, we stop being slaves to desire, even if only for a moment. Time halts. The will falls silent, and for a brief instant we become pure awareness. He writes, "Art lifts us out of the stream of willing and places us momentarily into pure knowing." Beyond art, Schopenhauer also points to nature, compassion, and even the voluntary denial of desire, an idea closely aligned with Eastern asceticism, like Buddhism. In these practices, the goal is not happiness, but relief from the tyranny of the will. That relief is not euphoria. It is peace, the temporary end of agitation. And perhaps that is where real freedom lies, not in the endless pursuit of more, but in the lucid acceptance of less. Here lies the central point, perhaps the most uncomfortable and also the most liberating of all Schopenhauer's philosophy. Full, continuous happiness, as we imagine it, simply does not exist. And the more we chase it as a fixed state, the more we drown in frustration. But this is not the end. It is the beginning of a more lucid life. The mistake is not in wanting to be happy. The mistake is believing that happiness comes from the fulfillment of all our desires, as if it were possible to build a permanent castle of satisfaction on the sand of impermanence, time, and death. Schopenhauer invites us to do the opposite of what modern culture preaches. Instead of chasing more stimulation, more victories, more dopamine, he invites us to retreat, to a more contemplative life, less driven by pleasure and more attuned to the silence of awareness. The fewer desires a man has, the closer he is to happiness. For him, freedom does not lie in conquering everything, but in wanting less, in leaving the game instead of trying to win it. It may sound radical, but perhaps it is the most sensible thing of all, because as long as we chase happiness as an obligation, we will live as slaves to dissatisfaction. But when we recognize that desire never fully fulfills, we gain the chance to free ourselves from its tyranny. This does not turn us into apathetic people. On the contrary, it makes us more present, less deluded, more serene. People who live not for the promise of a future paradise, but for the lucidity of a real moment. Schopenhauer's philosophy is not a self-help manual. It is, rather, a brutal mirror that forces us to face what we would rather avoid. But it is precisely because of that honesty that it has transformative power. By accepting that life owes us no happiness, we can finally stop demanding so much from it and from ourselves. By accepting pain as an inevitable part of existence, we can endure it with dignity, without masks. This acceptance is the beginning of freedom, not the freedom of euphoria, but of awareness, not of conquest, but of understanding. And then, in the silence that remains after illusions fall away, perhaps something will arise that no desire can ever give us: peace. And you, are you still chasing happiness or learning to stop?